In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But what happens when war itself becomes a god? What transforms noble warriors into blood-drunk monsters who tear through battlefields with nothing but rage in their hearts and carnage on their minds? Today, we're diving deep into the most terrifying force in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. We're exposing the horrifying truth behind Khorne, the blood god, and his army of psychotic killers who live for one purpose alone: to drown the galaxy in an ocean of blood. You think you understand violence in the 41st millennium? You think the Imperial Guard's mass casualties are brutal? You think the Space Marines' shock assaults are savage? You haven't seen anything yet. Because when Khorne's forces take the field, every other faction in the galaxy looks like children playing with toy soldiers. These aren't warriors fighting for emperor or freedom or survival. These are beings who have surrendered their souls to pure, unadulterated bloodlust. But here's what most people don't realize about Khorne and his followers. This isn't just mindless slaughter for the sake of killing. There's a twisted honor codes, a military precision at work here. There that would make Imperial tacticians weep with envy. And there's a psychological transformation so complete, so terrifying, that it makes every other form of corruption in the Warhammer universe seem merciful by comparison. I'm going to walk you through the complete hierarchy of Khorne's forces, from the lowest blood-crazed cultist to the mightiest demon princes. I'll show you exactly how normal human beings get transformed into killing machines who literally cannot stop themselves from butchering everything in sight. And I'll reveal the one secret about Khorne that even veteran Warhammer fans that makes his entire army infin often miss. Something idly more dangerous than you ever imagined. But first, let me paint you a picture of where this all begins. Picture a throne made entirely of skulls. Not metaphorically. Literally millions upon millions of skulls stacked into a mountain so high it disappears into the blood-red mists above. Sitting atop this grotesque monument, so radiating with barely, is a figure so massive contained fury that reality itself seems to crack around the edges just from his presence. This is Khorne, the blood god, the lord of skulls, the first and mightiest of the chaos gods. Every act of violence in the galaxy feeds him. Every murder committed in rage makes him stronger. Every battlefield where blood soaks into the earth becomes a shrine to his eternal hunger. He doesn't want to rule the galaxy. He wants to transform it into one endless, eternal battlefield where the only law is kill or be killed. Now you might be wondering how something like this even comes to exist. How does an abstract concept like violence and rage become a living, breathing entity with its own agenda and army? The answer lies in the very nature of the warp itself, that hellish dimension where emotions and thoughts take on physical form. Khorne didn't just appear one day fully formed, he grew. He evolved. Every time a primitive human raised a weapon in anger, every time a warrior felt the intoxicating rush of battle, every time someone chose violence over diplomacy, they, the warp, were feeding something in. This thing grew stronger with each passing millennium, gorging itself on humanity's capacity, reality until it achieved for Brat consciousness, until it became Khorne. But here's the truly terrifying part. T-Scheme Khorne isn't evil in the traditional sense. He doesn't like Tzeentch or corrupt like Nurgle or seduce like Slaanesh. He's honest about what he wants. He wants blood, and he wants it now. Their straightforward approach to almost something refreshing about his lies. No deception, no false galactic domination, no promises, just pure, honest violence. This honesty extends to his followers as well. When someone pledges themselves to Khorne, they know exactly what they're signing up for. They're not being tricked or manipulated. They're making a conscious choice to embrace their most violent impulses and follow them wherever they lead. And where they lead is always the same place: the battlefield. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. It starts small. A soldier who finds himself enjoying combat a little too much. A warrior who starts taking unnecessary risks just to feel the adrenaline rush. Someone who begins to see their enemies not as people to be defeated, but as obstacles to be destroyed. These tiny compromises, these little surrenders to violent impulse, they add up over time. Eventually, the person realizes they're no longer fighting for their original cause. They're fighting because they need to fight. The violence has become an addiction more powerful than any drug. They need the smell of blood, the sound of screaming, the feeling of their bone. Without weapon cutting through flesh and it, they feelless, lost empty purpose. This is when Khorne notices them. This is when his influence begins to seep into their minds, whispering promises of endless warfare, of battles that never end, of enemies that keep coming so the killing never has to stop. And for someone already addicted to violence, these whispers sound like the most beautiful music in the universe. The physical changes come next. The person's body begins to adapt to their new lifestyle of constant warfare. Their muscles grow larger and denser. Their reflexes become superhuman. Their tolerance for pain increases dramatically. But more importantly, their brain chemistry changes. The parts responsible for empathy, for mercy, for strategic thinking beyond immediate violence, they begin to atrophy and die. What's left isn't really human anymore. It's something that looks human, something that might even remember being human, but it's been hollowed out and filled with nothing but rage and bloodlust. These creatures can still use weapons, can still follow basic tactical instructions, can still coordinate attacks, but they've lost the ability to feel anything except the overwhelming need to kill. This transformation creates the perfect soldier for Khorne's purposes. They don't need food or rest or entertainment. They don't get homesick or question orders or worry about their families. They have no fears, no doubts, no hesitation. Point them at an enemy, and they'll charge forward without a second thought, cutting down anything in their path until either they die or everything else does. But Khorne's army isn't just made up of these transformed humans. The Blood God commands legions of supernatural human to begin with. These are creatures that were never daemons, entities born from pure warp energy and shaped by Khorne's will into living weapons of incredible power. The most numerous of these creatures are called blood letters, and they represent everything terrifying about Khorne's aesthetic philosophy. Imagine a humanoid figure, but taller and broader than any human, covered in red, scaly skin that seems to glisten with perpetual wetness. Their faces are dominated by massive jaws filled with needle-sharp teeth, perfect for tearing flesh from bone. Their hands end in jet-black claws capable of punching through the heaviest armor. Each blood letter carries a massive two-handed sword called a hell blade. These weapons aren't forged in any earthly sense. They're manifestations of pure warp energy, shaped by Khorne's will into instruments of destruction. A hell blade can cut through any material created by mortal hands. Tank armor, power armor, even the psychically reinforced barriers used by the most powerful psychers, all of it might as well be paper when faced with these supernatural weapons. What makes bloodletters truly terrifying isn't their physical capabilities, though those are impressive enough. It's their absolute single-mindedness. They have no other thoughts, no other desires, no other purpose except to kill in Khorne's name. They don't eat or sleep or rest. They don't feel pain or fear or uncertainty. They exist only to fight, and they're very, very good at it. But even these demon foot soldiers pale in comparison to Khorne's generals, the mighty bloodthirsters. These are greater daemons, entities so powerful that their mere presence in reality causes the laws of physics to bend and warp around them. A single bloodthirster is capable of taking on entire armies and winning. Picture something that stands 4 times the height of a normal human, with wings like a bat and horns like a bull. Its skin is the color of fresh blood, and actual flames dance around its massive form. In one hand, it carries an axe so large it could cleave a battle tank in 2 with a single swing. In the other, it wields a whip covered in brass spikes, each one capable of decapitating a human with the slightest touch. These creatures serve as Khorne's field commanders, leading his demon legions into battle with tactical skill that would impress even the greatest imperial generals. But unlike mortal commanders, they lead from the front, charging into the thickest fighting and carving through enemy ranks like a scythe through wheat. The most powerful of these beings have individual names and reputations that strike fear into the hearts of even space marines. They've fought in battles accumulating millennia of combat experience. Some thousands of worlds, Akhum have faced down entire space marine chapters and emerged victorious. Others have led demonic invasions that consumed entire star systems. Yet for all their individual power, these greater demons answer to an even more terrifying entity. Among their stirs, there exists one Bloodth, whose name is whispered in terror, even by his own kind. Skarbrand, the Exiled One, once the greatest of all Khorne's servants, now wanders the galaxy as a living testament to the blood god's capacity for both favor and punishment. Skarbrand's fall from grace reveals about Khorne's nature something crucial that most people completely miss. The blood god demands absolute loyalty, but he also demands absolute honesty. When Skarbrand was manipulated by Tsanj into raising his weapon against Khorne himself, the betrayal wasn't forgiven. It couldn't be forgiven. Khorne cast his exile, condemn greatest champion into eternalling him to wander between realms, never again to know the comfort of his master's domain. But here's the twisted part. Skarbrand's exile hasn't made him less dangerous. It's made him infinitely more so. Driven by frustration and an impossible desire to earn his way back into Khorne's favor, Skarbrand now leads campaigns of slaughter that dwarf anything he accomplished before his fall. He's become a walking apocalypse, leaving trails of devastation across the galaxy that take decades to even catalog, let alone repair. The lesson here isn't lost on Khorne's other servants. Loyalty to the blood god isn't just expected. It's the only thing that matters. Betray that loyalty, even unknowingly, even through manipulation, and you'll face punishment that makes death look like mercy. This knowledge creates a paranoid intensity among Khorne's followers that makes them even more dangerous than they'd suggest. Now, raw combat abilities will... You might be wondering how these demonic entities actually make their way into real space to wreak havoc on the material universe. The answer lies in one of the most disturbing aspects of Khorne's worship: the summoning rituals performed by his mortal followers. These aren't your typical cult ceremonies with candles and chanting. Khornate summoning rituals are exercises in systematic butchery designed to create enough bloodshed to tear holes between dimensions. The more violent the deaths, the more suffering involved, the more powerful the demon that can be called forth. A simple ritual might require the sacrifice of 8 prisoners, their blood spilled in specific patterns while their skulls are arranged in sacred geometries. But the truly massive summonings, the ones that bring forth bloodthirsters or entire demon legions, these require industrial levels of carnage. Entire cities might be put to the sword, their populations systematically slaughtered over the course of days or weeks, all to create the psychic resonance necessary to bridge the gap between the warp and reality. The number 8 features prominently in all these rituals, though nobody truly understands why Khorne has such an affinity for this particular digit. His demon legions are organized into groups of 8. His brass citadel in the warp is surrounded by 8 towers. The most powerful summoning rituals require 8 times 8 sacrifices. Even his mortal followers unconsciously incorporate this number into their battle formations and ceremonial scarification. This brings us to the most horrifying aspect of Khorne's influence, his effect on normal human beings. Because while demons are terrifying in their own right, they're still obviously supernatural threats. The real horror comes when you realize that your neighbor, your colleague, your commanding officer might be slowly transforming into one of Khorne's servants right before your eyes. The corruption doesn't announce itself with dramatic physical mutations or obvious signs of demonic possession. It starts with subtle behavioral changes. A soldier who used to show mercy to surrendering enemies suddenly stops taking prisoners. A planetary governor who once tried to minimize civilian casualties begins implementing increasingly brutal policies. A space marine who once exemplified the noble ideals of the unnecessary risks in combat imperium starts taking most dangerous opponents not. Seeking out the for strategic reasons, but for the sheer joy fight. These of the changes seem gradual, even reasonable, given the harsh realities of life in the 41st millennium. After your enemy's usually a galaxy where showing seen as weakness in compassion to all, mercy is often gets you and everyone you're trying to protect killed. The line between necessary brutality and unnecessary cruelty becomes increasingly blurred. But that blurring is exactly how Khorne operates. He doesn't corrupt through grand gestures or obvious temptations. He corrupts through 1,000 small compromises, each one seeming perfectly justified in the moment. Every time someone chooses violence when diplomed, every time they Yacy might have work kill when capture would have sufficed, every time they let their anger override their judgment, they're feeding the blood god and bringing themselves one step closer to damnation. The most insidious part is that this corruption often makes people more effective in the short term. A commander who stops worrying about civilian casualties can achieve military objectives more quickly. A soldier who embraces his violent impulses becomes a more fearsome warrior. A judge who stops showing mercy can clear cases more efficiently. The immediate benefits mask the long-term spiritual cost until it's far too late to turn back. This is how entire Imperial Guard regiments have fallen to Khorne's influence without anyone noticing, until it was too late. The soldiers start taking more risks, seeking out more dangerous assignments, volunteering for the most brutal combat roles. Their casualty rates might actually improve because they're fighting with a ferocity that overwhelms their enemies. Their commanders commend them for their dedication and courage. Only later, when these same soldiers start turning on their own allies for not being aggressive enough, when they begin executing prisoners not for strategic reasons but because they enjoy the killing, when they start carving Khornate symbols into their own flesh and screaming battle cries to the blood god, only then does anyone realize what's happened. By that spread far beyond the original infectee point, the corruption has usually unit. Khorne's influence is contagious in the most literal sense. Exposure to extreme violence, especially violence committed with religious fervor, has a psychological impact that makes observers more likely to embrace similar extremes. Witnessing atrocities can traumatize normal people, but it can also desensitize them, making them more accepting of violence as a solution to problems. This is why Khornate cults spread so rapidly through military organizations and violent societies. Each act of Khorne-inspired brutality creates witnesses who become slightly more susceptible to the blood god's influence. Some resist, of course. Some maintain their moral center despite repeated exposure to horror. But others find themselves drawn to the simplicity of the clarity Khorne's philosophy of a worldview, where every problem can be solved with sufficient application of violence. The most tragic cases are those who fall to Khorne while genuinely believing they're serving a righteous cause. Imperial commanders who embrace increasingly brutal tactics in the name of protecting humanity from alien threats. Space Marines who convince themselves that their growing bloodlust is simply dedication to the Emperor's will. Planetary governors who implement genocidal policies while telling themselves they're preserving order and stability. These individuals often maintain their original up until the moment they fully loyalties and beliefs transform into Khorne's servants. They don't see themselves as traitors or heretics. They see themselves as patriots who are simply willing to do what others won't, to make the hard choices that weaker people avoid. This self-deception makes them incredibly dangerous because they retain their intelligence, their strategic thinking, and their positions of authority, even as they become instruments of the blood god's will. The transformation reaches its ultimate expression in the Khornate Berzerkers, warriors who have undergone surgical procedures to remove their capacity for fear-thinking beyond mercy and strategic, immediate combat effectiveness. These procedures, originally developed by the traitorous World Eaters Legion, involve implanting cybernetic devices called Butcher's Nails directly into the subject's brain. The Butcher's Nails don't just enhance aggression. They create incapable of experiencing a neurological dependency on violence that makes the subject literally pleasure or satisfaction through any means other than killing. Without Berserkers experience regular combat, withdrawal symptoms that drive them into fits of homicidal rage. They become so addicted to the neurochemical high of violence that they'll attack their own allies if no enemies are available. This creates warriors of unparalleled ferocity who feel no fear, show no mercy, and never retreat. But it also creates beings who can barely be called human anymore. They retain their combat skills and basic tactical knowledge, but they've lost the ability to form meaningful relationships, to appreciate art or beauty, to experience love or compassion. They exist in a state of perpetual, barely controlled fury that can only be temporarily sated through acts of extreme violence. The psychological horror of the Butcher's Nails extends far beyond their immediate effects on the brain. These devices represent the ultimate fusion of technology and corruption, a perfect example of how humanity's greatest achievements can be twisted into instruments of damnation. The original design wasn't created by Chaos worshippers at all. It was developed by the techno-barbarian rulers of Nuceria as a method of controlling their gladiatorial slaves, ensuring that their fighters would never know fear or hesitation in the arena. When Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters Legion, was discovered on Nuceria, he already bore these implants. The Emperor himself could have removed them, could his son have free from their influence. But the Great Crusade needed soldiers, and Angron with his nails was an incredibly effective killer the Emperor made. So, a compromise, allowing his son to keep the devices that were slowly destroying his mind. That single decision would eventually doom an entire Space Marine Legion. You see, Angron didn't just keep his nails, he shared them. He had his Legion's apothecaries study the technology, refine it, improve upon it. What had once been crude gladiatorial control devices became sophisticated neural modifications that could turn any Space Marine into a perfect killing machine. The World Eaters embraced this transformation willingly, seeing it as the ultimate expression of their warrior heritage nails carry. But they'd a hidden price. They didn't just enhance aggression and remove fear. They created a neurological pathway that made their victims increasingly susceptible to warp influence. Every battle fought, every enemy killed, every moment spent in the grip of artificial rage opened the mind further. Purs. The world, to Khorne's whispering eaters, thought they were becoming better soldiers. In reality, they were becoming perfect vessels for the blood god's will. The transformation wasn't immediate. For years, even decades, the nails seemed but like nothing a tactical advantage. The World Eaters became renowned as the most effective assault troops in the entire Imperial arsenal. Their casualty rates were low because they fought with such ferocity that enemies often broke and ran rather than face them. Their morale was unshakable because they literally couldn't experience fear. It was only during the Horus Heresy that the true cost became apparent. When Angron finally pledged himself to Khorne, his sons followed without question, not because they were particularly loyal to, but because the Chaos Nails had prepared them for this moment. The artificial rage that had served them so well in the Emperor's name simply found a new target. The same neural pathways that had made them perfect Imperial soldiers now made them perfect servants of the Blood God. The irony is that they corrupted themselves. Through Khorne didn't even need to corrupt their own desire to become better warriors. Every modification they made to their brains, every enhancement they added to their capacity for violence, brought them closer to the Blood God's embrace. Bid what was happening, they were already lost the time they realize. This pattern has repeated itself countless times throughout the galaxy. Well-meaning military commanders implement training programs designed to make their soldiers more aggressive and fearless. Planetary defense forces adopt combat drugs that suppress fear and enhance physical performance. Space Marine chapters develop new combat doctrines that emphasize close-quarters brutality over tactical flexibility. Each time, the results seem positive initially. Casualty rates drop, enemy forces flee rather than fight, morale improves. But every one of these innovations creates vulnerabilities that Khorne can exploit. The combat remove fear, also drugs that remove empathy. The training programs that enhance aggression also reduce impulse control. The tacticalized brute doctrines that emphasality also devalue human life. These changes might seem minor, even beneficial, until they reach a critical threshold where the affected individuals are no longer fully the most disturbing aspect of human. This process is how rational to outside it appears observers. When a regiment starts showing increased combat effectiveness, their commanding officers naturally want to understand why. When they discover the training methods or chemical enhancements responsible, they often implement similar programs in other units. The corruption spreads not through mystical influence or demonic possession, but through standard, entirely reasonable in the military bureaucratic desire to give soldiers every possible advantage. This is how entire sectors of the Imperium have fallen to Khorne's influence, without anyone realizing it until far too late. The corruption doesn't announce itself with 8-pointed stars or obvious chaos imagery. it spreads through military efficiency reports, casualty statistics, and performance evaluations. By the time the infected units start displaying obviously heretical behavior, they've already trained hundreds Simons in their, of other regime-proved methods. The blood god's influence extends beyond individual corruption to affect entire military cultures. Regiments that serve alongside Khornate-influenced units often find themselves adopting similar tactics and attitudes. Officers who witness the effectiveness of extreme brutality start implementing similar policies in their own commands. Veterans who survive battles alongside blood-crazed warriors often develop a taste for that level of intensity themselves. This cultural transmission is particularly dangerous because it doesn't require direct contact with chaos forces. A single corrupted officer can influence dozens of subordinates through training and example. Those subordinates then carry that influence to new assignments, spreading it throughout the military hierarchy like a virus. Within a generation, what started as isolated corruption can become standard operating procedure across entire military organizations. The Imperium's response to this threat reveals both the strength and weakness of its approach to chaos corruption. When obvious heretical behavior is detected, the Imperial response is swift and absolute. Entire regiments are disbanded, their members executed or subjected to extensive purification rituals. Suspected corruption is treated as confirmed corruption, better to destroy loyal soldiers than risk allowing. But this approach, heretics to escape while effective against obvious threats, fails completely early stages of against subtle influence. The Khornate corruption are almost impossible to distinguish from legitimate military excellence. How do you prosecute a commander for being too effective? How do you condemn soldiers for showing exceptional courage and aggression? The very qualities that make good Imperial soldiers also make them vulnerable to the blood god's influence. This creates a paradox that Khorne exploits ruthlessly. The Imperium needs violent, aggressive soldiers to survive in a galaxy full of threats. But violence and aggression are exactly the qualities that the blood god seeks to corrupt. Every training program designed to make Imperial forces more effective potentially opens them to Khornate influence. Every battlefield success achieved through superior brutality feeds the very force that threatens to destroy them. The most elite Imperial forces are often the most vulnerable to this corruption. Space Marines, the Emperor's angels of death, are trained from childhood to be perfect warriors. Their psycho-conditioning removes fear, doubt, and hesitation. Their physical modifications make them capable of incredible violence. Their tactical training emphasizes aggressive assault and overwhelming force. In many ways, they're already halfway to becoming Khornate Berzerkers before they ever encounter chaos influence. This vulnerability explains why entire Space Marine chapters have fallen to Khorne over the millennia. The same qualities that make them the Imperium's greatest defenders also make them susceptible to the blood god's wise dedication to martial an obsession with purs. Their excellence becomes violence for its own sake. Their courage in battle becomes reckless. Blue Brothers becomes a packed lust. Their loyalty to their battle is all other considerations. The fallen mentality that exclude chapters that serve Khorne today. Imperium's most honoree were once among their defenders. The World Eaters were originally tasked with the most difficult assault missions, their courage and skill saving countless worlds from alien invasion. The Berzerkers of Khorne, who now terrorize Imperial space, were once heroes who bled for humanity's survival. Their fall demonstrates that no one, no matter how pure their intentions or noble their origins, is immune to Khorne's corruption, but to military organizations. The Blood God's influence isn't limited. Civilian populations can fall under his sway just as easily, though the process looks different. Where military corruption focuses on combat effectiveness and tactical brutality, civilian corruption manifests as social violence and systematic oppression. A planetary governor who starts implementing harsher punishments for civil disobedience. A judge who begins handing out increasingly severe sentences. A factory foreman who uses violence to maintain production quotas. Each of these changes seems reasonable in isolation. Crime rates do drop when criminals face harsher punishments. Worker productivity does increase when supervisors are willing to use physical discipline. Social order is easier to maintain when dissent is met with immediate violence. The immediate benefits mask the spiritual cost until entire societies have transformed into engines of systematic brutality. The most insidious civilian cults of Khorne don't even recognize themselves as religious organizations. They present themselves as law enforcement agencies, military contractors, or social reform movements. Their members genuinely believe they're making better through the society application of controlled violence. They develop elaborate justifications for their actions, complex philosophical frameworks that explain why their brutality serves the greater good. These cults can operate for decades without detection because their activities align so closely with legitimate imperial governance. A hive city where criminals are executed publicly isn't unusual in the 41st millennium. A factory complex where workers face physical punishment for poor performance is sadly common. A military academy where cadets are subjected to extreme hazing and brutalization is considered normal preparation for imperial service. Only when these organizations begin displaying obviously heretical behavior does anyone realize what they've become. The law enforcement agency starts executing citizens for increasingly minor infractions. The military contractor begins taking contracts that involve genocide rather than simple warfare. The social reform movement starts advocating for the complete elimination of weakness from human society through systematic violence. By that point, the corruption has usually spread far beyond the original organization. These groups train personnel who then move on to other positions throughout the imperial hierarchy. They develop policies and procedures that get adopted by other agencies. They create cultural norms that influence entire planetary populations. What started as isolated corruption becomes systemic transformation of human society. The speed of this transformation varies depending on local conditions, but the pattern remains consistent. Societies under stress are more vulnerable to Khornate influence because violence seems like a reasonable response to immediate threats. Worlds facing alien invasion, heretical uprising, or economic collapse often embrace increasingly brutal solutions to their problems. Each escalation seems justified by circumstances until the society has crossed the line into outright barbarity. The most tragic cases are those where the corruption serves genuinely noble goals initially. A planetary government implements harsh emergency measures to deal with a crisis, intending to return to normal governance once the threat passes. But the emergency powers prove so effective that they become permanent policy. The harsh measures become increasingly severe as administrators discover that greater violence produces better results. Within a generation, what was once a civilized world has become a nightmare of systematic oppression and casual brutality. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of normalizing almost any level of violence if it's introduced gradually enough. Children who grow up in violent societies often can't imagine any other way of life. Adults who witness increasing brutality often adjust their moral standards to match their circumstances. This adaptability, which helps humanity survive in the grim darkness of the far future, also makes them perfect victims for Khorne's corruption. The Blood God doesn't need to break people Eshoj's spirits or alter their beliefs. He simply needs to redirect their existing values toward more violent expressions. A parent's desire to protect their children becomes support for genocidal policies against alien threats. A worker's pride in their craft becomes enthusiasm for weapons production. A citizen's loyalty to their world becomes participation in systematic oppression of dissidents. Each individual choice seems reasonable, even admirable, when viewed in isolation. It's only when you step back and look at the larger pattern that the horror becomes apparent. Millions of good, decent people making rational decisions that collectively transform their society into something monstrous. They don't see themselves as servants of chaos. They see themselves as patriots, protectors, and pragmatists doing what needs to be done in a dangerous galaxy. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Khorne's influence. Unlike the other chaos gods, who corrupt through obvious temptation or clear moral compromise, the Blood God works through the noblest human impulses. The desire to protect loved ones, to serve a greater cause, to be strong enough to face any threat. These admirable qualities become pathways to damnation when pushed to their logical extremes. The transformation doesn't stop with individual corruption or even societal decay. Khorne's ultimate goal is the complete militarization of human civilization, turning entire star systems into recruitment grounds for his eternal war. This process begins subtly, with increased defense spending and military recruitment drives that seem entirely reasonable, given the galaxy's countless threats. Planetary governments start viewing every problem through a military lens. Economic difficulties become resource wars, political disagreements become armed conflicts, cultural differences become crusades for ideological purity. What makes this transformation particularly insidious is how it feeds on humanity's genuine need for military strength. The Imperium faces real threats from alien invasions, demon incursions, and heretical uprisings. Worlds that fail to maintain adequate defenses often face extinction. This constant pressure creates a perfect environment for Khornate influence to take root and flourish without detection. Military academies become breeding grounds for the Blood God's philosophy. Young cadets learn that mercy is weakness, that hesitation kills, that the only good enemy is a dead enemy. These lessons serve them well in their first battles against orcs and tyrannids. The graduates who survive become instructors themselves, passing on increasingly extreme interpretations of these principles to the next generation. Each iteration becomes slightly more brutal, slightly more willing to embrace violence as the answer to every question. The process accelerates when these military leaders assume civilian positions. Retired officers become planetary governors, bringing military solutions to civilian problems. Former sergeants become law enforcement officials, treating crime as warfare against society. Veterans become teachers, passing their worldview on to children who have never known anything but preparation for conflict. The line between military and civilian society gradually disappears until entire worlds exist in a state of permanent martial law. Industrial production shifts to support this militarization. Factories that once produced consumer goods retool for weapons manufacturing. Agricultural worlds redirect their output to feed standing armies, rather than civilian populations. Mining operations prioritize materials needed for war machines over infrastructure development. The economy becomes entirely focused on enabling greater levels of violence, creating a feedback loop that makes peaceful solutions increasingly impossible. Cultural institutions undergo similar transformations. Artists create propaganda glorifying military service and violent heroism. Writers produce literature celebrating the nobility of warfare and the honor found in death. Musicians compose martial anthems that stir bloodlust in their listeners. Entertainment becomes indoctrination, teaching each generation that their highest aspiration should be to die gloriously in battle. The very concept of peace becomes alien, something only cowards and weaklings desire. Religious observances merge with military ceremonies until they become indistinguishable. Prayers for victory replace prayers for peace. Sermons focus on righteous anger rather than compassion. Holy days commemorate battles rather than moments of divine mercy. The emperor's teachings get reinterpreted to emphasize his role as a warrior rather than a protector, his conquest of Terra rather than his vision of human unity. Traditional imperial faith becomes a war cult that differs from Khornate worship only in the name of its patron deity. Educational systems complete this transformation by ensuring that children never learn alternatives to violence. History classes focus exclusively on military campaigns and glorious battles. Philosophy courses teach that conflict is the natural state of existence and that strength determines moral worth. Science education emphasizes weapons development and battlefield medicine over peaceful applications. Students graduate believing that their primary purpose in life is to serve as soldiers in humanity's endless wars. The most frightening aspect of this process is how successful it appears to outside observers. Worlds that undergo complete militarization often do become more effective at defending themselves against external threats. Their armies fight with fanatical determination. Their populations support military operations without question. Their industrial capacity focuses entirely on war production, making them valuable assets to the broader imperial war machine. From a strategic perspective, these transformations seem like unqualified successes. Imperial administrators actively encourage this militarization when they encounter it, spreading successful models to other worlds facing similar challenges. A planet that repels an orc invasion through total societal mobilization becomes a template for other worlds in the sector. Military advisors study their tactics and organizational structures, implementing similar systems wherever they're stationed. The corruption spreads through official channels, carried by the very bureaucracy designed to protect humanity from chaos influence. The Adeptus Mechanicus plays an unwitting role in this process through their development of increasingly sophisticated weapons and enhancement technologies. Combat stimulants that suppress fear and pain make soldiers more effective, but also more susceptible to Khornate influence. Surgical procedures that enhance aggression and reflexes create warriors who depend on violence for psychological stability. Cybernetic implants that improve combat performance often come with side effects that mirror the symptoms of chaos corruption. These technologies spread throughout the imperial military because they provide genuine tactical advantages. A regiment equipped with aggression enhancers will outperform unmodified troops in direct combat. Soldiers with pain suppressors can continue fighting through injuries that would incapacitate normal humans. Officers with reaction time boosters can coordinate complex battles with superhuman precision. The immediate benefits make adoption of these technologies seem not just reasonable, but mandatory for competitive military organizations. But each technological enhancement creates dependencies that make users more vulnerable to supernatural corruption. Soldiers who rely on chemical stimulants to function in battle become psychologically addicted to the artificial highs these drugs provide. Warriors with cybernetic pain suppressors lose the ability to recognize when they're taking unnecessary risks. Officers with enhanced reaction times begin to see normal human responses as pathetic weakness, deserving only contempt. These dependencies create psychological profiles that mirror natural Khornate corruption so closely that the transition from technological enhancement to supernatural influence becomes seamless. A soldier who depends on combat drugs to feel normal is already halfway toward the neurochemical addiction that characterizes Berzerkers. A warrior who views pain as irrelevant is already prepared to embrace the Khornate philosophy that suffering is meaningless compared to victory. The technology doesn't corrupt them directly, but it prepares them perfectly for corruption when the opportunity arises. Space Marine chapters face unique vulnerabilities in this regard because their enhancement technologies are more sophisticated and their psychological conditioning more extreme. The gene seed modifications that make them superhuman also make them more susceptible to certain types of warp influence. Their training removes normal human limitations on violence and aggression. Their culture celebrates martial excellence above all other virtues. They're essentially purpose-built to be perfect ornate recruits, held by their loyalty to the Emperor and back-only'd their chapter traditions. When that loyalty wavers or those traditions become corrupted, the fall is swift and catastrophic. Entire chapters have turned to chaos overnight when their leadership embraced Khornate philosophy. The same genetic modifications that made them the Emperor's angels of death make them incredibly effective servants of the Blood God. Their tactical training adapts perfectly to Khornate warfare. Their psychological conditioning actually enhances their ability to embrace mindless violence. The flesh-tearers, the Blood Angels' successors known for their barely controlled rage, exemplify this dangerous balance. Their gene seed flaw makes them prone to episodes of berserk fury that closely resemble Khornate possession. They've managed to remain loyal to the Imperium through strict discipline and constant vigilance, but many Imperial observers wonder how long they can maintain this precarious balance. Each battle they fight, each moment of rage they experience, brings them closer to the line between righteous fury and damnable bloodlust. Similar vulnerabilities exist throughout the Imperial military hierarchy, though they manifest differently at different levels. Guard regiments that specialize in assault warfare often develop cultural practices that mirror Khornate rituals. Navy crews that serve on ships, engaged in constant combat, begin to view violence as the only meaningful form of human interaction. Planetary Defense Force units that face repeated invasions start to see civilian populations as obstacles rather than people to protect. The Commissariat attempts to monitor and control these tendencies through political education and summary execution of obvious heretics. But commissars themselves are vulnerable to the same corrupting influences that affect the troops they're supposed to police. A commissar who witnesses exceptional combat effectiveness achieved through extreme brutality may begin to encourage similar behavior in other units. An officer who sees the morale benefits of embracing violent rhetoric may incorporate such language into their own speeches and reports. The most insidious corruption occurs when commissars become convinced that Khornate-influenced behavior actually serves the Emperor's will more effectively than traditional imperial doctrine. They develop elaborate theological justifications for increasingly extreme policies. They argue that the emperor's true nature as a warrior god requires his servants to embrace their most violent impulses. They reinterpret imperial history to emphasize conquest and domination over unity and protection. These corrupted commissars become vectors for spreading Khornate influence throughout the Imperial Guard. Their authority allows them to implement training programs and tactical doctrines that push soldiers toward corruption. Their political education sessions become indoctrination into increasingly extreme philosophies. Their execution of dissidents becomes ritualized displays of violence that serve Khorne rather than imperial justice. The ecclesiarchy faces similar challenges in maintaining doctrinal purity while operating in a galaxy where violence is often the only viable solution to problems. Missionary work on frontier worlds requires preachers to deal with constant warfare and desperate circumstances. The theological challenges of explaining why a benevolent emperor allows such suffering to exist create openings for Khornate corruption to take root within religious doctrine itself. War priests who serve alongside Imperial Guard regiments are particularly vulnerable because their duties require them to bless weapons, sanctify battlefields, and provide spiritual comfort to soldiers engaged in systematic killing. The rituals they perform walk a fine line between acceptable imperial worship and heretical blood sacrifice. A preacher who becomes too enthusiastic about the violent aspects of imperial faith may cross that line without realizing it until far too late. The most dangerous corruption occurs when religious leaders become convinced that the emperor desires maximum violence from his servants. They begin preaching that mercy is heretical weakness, that the emperor's love can only be earned through the spilling of enemy blood, that the ultimate form of worship is the complete annihilation of all who oppose humanity. These doctrines spread through the ecclesiarchy's hierarchical structure, creating entire dioceses dedicated to what amounts to Khornate worship disguised as imperial faith. Pilgrimage sites become focal points for this corruption when they're associated with particularly bloody imperial victories. Shrine worlds that commemorate great battles attract worshippers who come seeking spiritual connection to the violence that occurred there. The rituals performed at these sites often involve reenactments of historical battles, symbolic sacrifices representing defeated enemies, and prayers for the strength to emulate the heroes who died there. These ceremonies can gradually transform from commemorations of necessary violence into celebrations of violence for its own sake. The Adeptus Arbites face unique challenges because their duties require them to use violence as a tool of social control. Arbitrators must maintain order in hive cities where billions of desperate people compete for limited resources. The scale of violence required to police such populations would horrify citizens of more peaceful eras, but it's accepted as necessary in the grim darkness of the far future. This normalization of extreme violence creates perfect conditions for Khornate corruption to flourish within law enforcement organizations. Arbitrator training emphasizes the need to respond to threats with overwhelming force, to show no mercy to criminals, and to view civilian populations as potential enemies, requiring constant surveillance. These doctrines serve legitimate law enforcement purposes in the dangerous environments where arbitrators operate, but they also create psychological profiles that align closely with Khornate philosophy. The line between necessary brutality and sadistic excess becomes increasingly difficult to identify when violence is both tool and environment. Precinct houses in the worst sectors of major hive cities often develop cultures that would be indistinguishable from Khornate cults, if not for their official imperial sanction. Arbitrators compete to see who can achieve the highest kill counts during patrol duties. They collect trophies from defeated criminals, displaying skulls and weapons as proof of their effectiveness. They develop initiation rituals that involve increasingly extreme demonstrations of violence and callousness toward human suffering. These practices spread throughout the Adeptus Arbites through personnel transfers and training exchanges. An arbitrator who serves in a particularly violent precinct carries those behavioral patterns to their next assignment. Training instructors who come from combat zones teach cadets that extreme violence is not just acceptable, but necessary for effective law enforcement. Within a generation, practices that began as adaptations to local conditions become standard operating procedures across entire sectors. The Inquisition represents humanity's last line of defense against chaos corruption. But even this organization faces challenges in dealing with Khornate influence. Inquisitors must use violence as a tool while avoiding corruption themselves. A balance that becomes increasingly difficult when dealing with threats that can only be countered through extreme measures. The psychological toll of constant exposure to the worst aspects of human nature creates vulnerabilities that Khorne can exploit even in these most dedicated servants of the Emperor. Ordo Malleus inquisitors who specialize in demon hunting are particularly at risk because their duties require them to study and understand the very entities they're fighting. Knowledge of Khornate tactics and psychology can gradually influence the Inquisitor's own approach to problem solving. An investigator who learns to think like a demon to predict its behavior may begin to act like a demon without realizing the transformation is occurring. The most dangerous corruptions occur when Inquisitors become convinced that Khornate methods are actually more effective at serving the Emperor than traditional imperial approaches. They begin using extreme violence not because it's necessary, but because it produces faster results. They start viewing mercy and compassion as obstacles to efficiency rather than virtues worth preserving. They develop philosophical frameworks that justify any level of brutality as long as it serves what they perceive to be the greater good. These corrupted inquisitors retain their authority and resources while serving Khorne's agenda rather than the Emperor's will. They can authorize military operations that result in massive casualties, issue exterminatus orders that destroy entire worlds, and implement policies that spread violence throughout the sectors under their jurisdiction. Their corruption is particularly dangerous because their actions carry official imperial sanction, making it almost impossible for other authorities to question or countermand their orders. The scope of Khorne's influence extends beyond individual corruption to affect the fundamental nature of human civilization in the 41st millennium. The constant warfare that defines this era isn't just a result of external threats and political conflicts. It's also a symptom of the Blood God's growing power, his ability to manipulate events and influence decisions on a galactic scale. Every war that erupts feeds him strength. Every battle that's fought in anger rather than necessity serves his agenda. Every peace treaty that fails because of mutual suspicion and hatred advances his ultimate goal of eternal conflict. Human nature itself becomes a weapon in Khorne's arsenal, because the qualities that make people effective warriors in the grim darkness of the far future are the same qualities that make them susceptible to his corruption. Courage becomes recklessness. Determination becomes obsession. Loyalty becomes fanaticism. Strength becomes brutality. The virtues that humanity needs to survive in this hostile galaxy transform into vices that serve the Blood God's agenda. The tragedy is that there's no clear solution to this problem. Humanity cannot abandon violence entirely, because doing so would mean extinction at the hands of alien threats and chaos incursions. But embracing violence, even for defensive purposes, opens pathways for Khorne corruption. Every weapon forged, every soldier trained, every battle won, strengthens the very force that threatens to destroy human civilization from within. This paradox creates a downward spiral that seems almost impossible to escape. The more threats humanity faces, the more violent they become in response. The more violent they become, the more they feed Khorne's power. The more powerful Khorne becomes, the more threats humanity faces as his influence spreads throughout the galaxy. Each cycle of this spiral makes the next one worse, creating a feedback loop that drives human civilization toward an inevitable confrontation with the Blood God himself. The question isn't whether humanity will eventually face this confrontation, but whether they'll retain enough of their original nature to recognize what they've become when that moment arrives. Will they see themselves as the Emperor's loyal servants, fighting against chaos corruption? Or will they have transformed so completely into instruments of violence that the distinction no longer matters? The answer may determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of the entire galaxy. The most chilling aspect of this galactic descent into bloodshed isn't the obvious corruption we can see and fight against. It's the invisible transformation happening in the shadows of every imperial institution, every military command, every civilian government that thinks they're still serving humanity's best interests. Because while we've been watching for daemon princes and obvious heretics, Khorne has been quietly reshaping the very foundations of human civilization. Consider the Imperial Navy, humanity's shield against the darkness between stars. These aren't ground troops who face enemies in brutal melee combat. These are ship crews who fight at distances measured in thousands of kilometers, where battles are won through superior tactics and technology rather than personal bloodlust. Yet even here, Khorne's influence seeps in through cracks most people never notice. It starts with the ship's officers celebrating particularly devastating broadsides against enemy vessels. There's nothing wrong with taking pride in effective gunnery, after all. But gradually, those celebrations become more elaborate, more focused on the destruction caused rather than the tactical advantage gained. Crew members start keeping tallies of enemy ships destroyed, comparing kill counts between different gun crews. What into obsession began as healthy competition transforms with maximizing casualties rather than achieving strategic objectives. The transformation accelerates during boarding actions, those desperate close-quarters battles that occur when ships are disabled and must be taken by force. Naval armsmen who once viewed boarding as a necessary evil begin volunteering for these assignments. They start requesting transfers to ships known for aggressive tactics. They modify their weapons for maximum lethality rather than tactical versatility. The same psychological pathways that create Khorne Berzerkers begin forming in the minds of sailors who never expected to face corruption. Ship captains notice that crews with these aggressive tendencies perform better in combat. Their gunnery is more accurate because they're emotionally invested in causing maximum damage. Their boarding parties are more effective because they fight with desperate intensity. Their morale remains high, even in desperate situations, because they've learned to find satisfaction in violence itself. From a command perspective, these changes look like improvements in military effectiveness. but the cost becomes apparent during interactions with civilian populations. Naval crews who have embraced this mindset begin treating merchant vessels as potential enemies rather than imperial citizens deserving protection. They interpret routine customs inspections as opportunities to demonstrate their authority through violence. They respond to minor infractions with punishments that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The same aggression that makes them effective against Chaos Raiders makes them dangerous to the people they're supposed to protect. This pattern repeats throughout the Imperial fleet as successful aggressive tactics spread through the standard chain of command and personnel transfers. A captain who achieves notable victories through extreme methods gets promoted and brings those methods to their new command. Officers who serve under aggressive commanders carry those lessons to their own ships when they receive their own commissions. Training academies study these success stories and incorporate the lessons into their curricula for future generations of naval officers. The Adeptus Mechanicus contributes to this process through their constant development of more effective weapons systems. Each new innovation makes ships more capable of inflicting devastating damage on their enemies. Plasma cannons that can punch through any armor, lance batteries that can cripple multiple targets with single shots, torpedo systems that turn enemy vessels into expanding clouds of radioactive debris. These weapons are marvels of human engineering, but they also create psychological dependencies similar to combat stimulants. Ship crews become addicted to the power these weapons represent. They start measuring their own worth by the destructive capacity of their armaments. They view ships with less advanced weapons as inferior, their crews as weaklings who couldn't handle real warfare. This technological elitism transforms into contempt for anyone who can't match their capacity for violence. They begin to see themselves as a warrior elite whose purpose is to bring destruction to the galaxy's enemies. The most insidious corruption occurs when these crews begin expanding their definition of who qualifies as an enemy. Merchant vessels that don't respond quickly enough to hails become suspicious. Civilian populations that don't show sufficient gratitude for naval protection become ungrateful. Fellow Imperial forces that use different tactics become incompetent allies, dragging down overall effectiveness. The aggressive mindset that once focused exclusively on external threats turns inward, creating conflicts within the very forces meant to defend humanity. Imperial Guard regiments that serve alongside these corrupted naval forces often find themselves caught in the crossfire of this transformation. Ground troops who request orbital bombardment support discover that Navy crews are more interested in maximizing destruction than providing precise tactical assistance. What should be surgical strikes become wholesale devastation that eliminates enemies and allies alike. The naval crews justify this as ensuring complete victory, but the real motivation is their addiction to causing maximum damage. This creates a feedback loop where ground forces must become more aggressive to survive the collateral damage from their own naval support. Guard regiments adapt by spreading out their formations, accepting higher casualty rates, and developing tactics that assume friendly fire will be a constant threat. These adaptations make them more effective at surviving in chaotic combat environments, but they also push the soldiers toward embracing the same violent mindset that corrupted their naval allies. The transformation spreads beyond active military units to affect the massive industrial complexes that support imperial warfare. Forge worlds that produce weapons and ammunition find their output quotas constantly increasing as military demands grow. Factory workers who once took pride in crafting precision instruments become focused on maximizing production volume. Quality control standards get relaxed in favor of quantity. The craftsmanship that once characterized Mechanicus manufacturing gives way to crude efficiency designed to flood the galaxy with increasingly deadly weapons. Workers in these facilities begin to see themselves as participants in the greater war effort rather than simple manufacturers. They take pride in knowing their products will kill enemies of humanity. They compete to see whose production lines can create the most lethal weapons. They develop personal attachments to specific weapon designs, following reports of their performance in combat zones across the galaxy. What should be detached industrial labor becomes emotionally invested participation in systematic violence. The psychological effects extend to civilian populations on worlds where these facilities operate. Children grow up surrounded by weapons production and military preparation. Their play involves mimicking the soldiers who will use the weapons their parents produce. Their education emphasizes their role in supporting the war effort. Their career aspirations focus on contributing to humanity's military dominance. Entire generations grow up unable to imagine any purpose beyond enabling greater levels of violence. These worlds become recruitment grounds for increasingly extreme military organizations. Young people who grew up celebrating weapons production eagerly volunteer for the most dangerous combat roles. They see military service not as a duty to be endured, but as the ultimate expression of their life's purpose. They compete for positions in assault units, boarding parties, and other high-casualty assignments because they've been conditioned to view violent death as the highest honor a human can achieve. The Schola Progenium, the imperial organization responsible for educating the children of deceased imperial servants, becomes a vector for spreading this militant mindset throughout the administrative hierarchy. These institutions were always military in character, designed to produce loyal servants for the Imperium's various organizations. But as Khornati influence spreads through imperial culture, the education provided at these schools becomes increasingly focused on combat effectiveness rather than administrative competence. Students who once would have become clerks, scribes, and bureaucrats now receive combat training alongside their academic education. The curriculum emphasizes physical fitness, weapons proficiency, and tactical thinking over traditional administrative skills. Graduates emerge believing that their primary qualification for imperial service is their ability to use violence effectively, rather than their capacity for managing complex organizations. These militarized administrators carry their combat-focused mindset into civilian government positions throughout the Imperium. Planetary governors who received Schola Progenium education approach every policy decision as if it were a military operation. They respond to civil unrest with overwhelming force, rather than attempting to address underlying grievances. They organize their administrations along military lines, with strict hierarchies and harsh punishments for failure to follow orders. The policies implemented by these governments push civilian populations toward embracing violence as a solution to all problems. Crime gets met with public executions rather than rehabilitation programs. Economic difficulties get addressed through forced labor rather than structural reforms. Political opposition gets eliminated through systematic persecution rather than democratic processes. The entire concept of civilian governance disappears, replaced by military occupation disguised as legitimate administration. Educational systems throughout the Imperium undergo similar transformations as military-minded administrators reshape curricula to emphasize combat preparation over intellectual development. History classes focus exclusively on military campaigns and tactical innovations. Literature courses study only works that glorify warfare and sacrifice. Science education prioritizes weapons development and battlefield medicine over peaceful applications of knowledge. Students graduate, believing that their highest purpose is to serve as soldiers in humanity's endless wars. The most tragic casualties of this process are the worlds that successfully resist external military threats, but lose their souls in the process. Planets that repel chaos invasions through total societal mobilization often find they cannot return to peaceful civilian governance afterward. The emergency measures implemented during the crisis become permanent features of planetary administration. The military units formed to fight invaders become permanent security forces policing the civilian population. The industrial capacity redirected toward weapons production never shifts back to civilian goods. These worlds become showcases for what imperial administrators see as successful military governance. Their crime rates are low because dissent is met with summary execution. Their production quotas are consistently met because workers face physical punishment for poor performance. Their military recruitment goals are always exceeded because young people see military service as their only path to social advancement. From a statistical perspective, these worlds appear to be thriving examples of imperial efficiency, but the human cost of this efficiency is staggering. Entire generations grow up, never experiencing peace, never learning that conflict isn't humanity's natural state, never developing the capacity for empathy and compassion that makes civilization possible. They become perfect soldiers for the Imperium's wars, but they cease to be the human beings that those wars were originally fought to protect. The irony is that this transformation often makes worlds more vulnerable to chaos, corruption, rather than less. Populations that have embraced violence as their primary value system are already aligned with Khorne philosophy before any demon ever sets foot on their world. When chaos cults do emerge, they find fertile ground among people who have been conditioned to see brutality as virtue and mercy as weakness. The very militarization that was supposed to protect these worlds from chaos becomes the pathway through which corruption enters. Space Marine chapters that recruit from these militarized worlds face unique challenges because their potential initiates have already been shaped by Khorne influence before they ever undergo the transformation into Astartes. The psychological conditioning that creates Space Marines builds upon existing mental frameworks, and if those frameworks are already aligned with violent extremism, the resulting warriors may be technically loyal to the Emperor while serving Khorne's agenda in practice. Chapter Masters often struggle to identify this corruption because it manifests as exceptional combat effectiveness rather than obvious heretical behavior. Battle brothers who embrace unnecessary risks appear to be displaying admirable courage. Sergeants who push their squads toward maximum aggression seem to be excellent tactical leaders. Captains who advocate for more brutal assault strategies appear to be dedicated to achieving victory at any cost. The corruption only becomes apparent when these Marines begin displaying contempt for Imperial citizens, treating civilian populations as obstacles rather than people to protect. They start interpreting their role as humanity's guardians as a license to impose their will through violence. They develop belief systems that justify any level of brutality as long as it serves what they perceive to be the Emperor's will. By the time these symptoms become obvious, the corruption has usually spread throughout entire companies or even entire chapters. The Death Watch, that organization of Space Marines dedicated to fighting alien threats, faces particular vulnerability to Khorne corruption because their mission requires them to become experts in violence against non-human entities. The psychological distance between alien enemies and human civilians can become dangerously narrow when warriors spend their entire careers perfecting methods of systematic extermination. Kill teams that specialize in eliminating specific Xenos species sometimes develop methodologies that would be equally effective against human populations. And there you have it, the complete, horrifying truth about Khorne's blood-crazed army and their insidious influence throughout the galaxy. From the towering bloodthirsters to the corrupted Imperial commanders who think they're still serving the Emperor, we've seen how the Blood God operates not through obvious temptation, but through the gradual transformation of humanity's greatest virtues into instruments of damnation. The most terrifying revelation isn't that demons exist, or that chaos can corrupt space marines. It's that every institution designed to protect humanity contains the seeds of its own corruption. Every training program that creates better soldiers also creates potential servants of Khorne. Every technological advancement that enhances combat effectiveness also opens new pathways for the Blood God's influence. The very qualities that make humans capable of surviving in the grim darkness of the far future are the same qualities that make them vulnerable to eternal damnation. So the next time you see an Imperial Guard regiment celebrating their combat effectiveness, or a planetary governor implementing harsh new security measures, or a Space Marine chapter developing more aggressive tactics, ask yourself, are they serving the Emperor's will? Or have they already begun their descent into Khorne's bloody embrace? Because in the 41st millennium, the line between righteous fury and damnable bloodlust isn't just thin. Sometimes it doesn't exist at all.